Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Allen, and welcome back to What a Book. Today, we continue on in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Chapter 6 Talons and Tea Leaves. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered the Great Hall for breakfast the next day, the first thing they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of Slytherins with a very funny story. As they passed, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter. "Ignore him," said Hermione, who was right behind Harry. "Just ignore him. It's not worth it." "Hey, Potter!" shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl with a face like a pug. "Potter! The Dementors are coming! Potter! Woo!" Harry dropped into a seat at the Gryffindor table, next to George Weasley. "New third-year course schedules," said George, passing them over. "What's up with you, Harry?" "Malfoy," said Ron, sitting down on George's other side and glaring over at the Slytherin table. George looked up in time to see Malfoy pretending to faint with terror again. "That little git," he said calmly. "He wasn't so cocky last night when the Dementors were down at our end of the train. Came running into our compartment, didn't he, Fred?" "Nearly wet himself," said Fred, with a contemptuous glance at Malfoy. "I wasn't too happy myself," said George. "They're horrible things, those Dementors." "Sort of freeze your insides, don't they?" said Fred. "You didn't pass out, though, did you?" said Harry in a low voice. "Forget it, Harry," said George bracingly. "Dad had to go out to Azkaban one time, remember, Fred? And he said it was the worst place he'd ever been. He came back all weak and shaking. They suck the happiness out of a place, Dementors. Most of the prisoners go mad in there." "Anyway, we'll see how happy Malfoy looks after our first Quidditch match," said Fred. "Gryffindor versus Slytherin, first game of the season, remember?" The only time Harry and Malfoy had faced each other in a Quidditch match, Malfoy had definitely come off worse. Feeling slightly more cheerful, Harry helped himself to sausages and fried tomatoes. Hermione was examining her new schedule. "Ooh, good. We're starting some new subjects today," she said happily. "Hermione," said Ron, frowning as he looked over her shoulder. "They've messed up your schedule. Look, they've got you down for about 10 subjects a day. There isn't enough time." "I'll manage. I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." "But look," said Ron, laughing. "See this morning? 9 o'clock, divination, and underneath, 9 o'clock, Muggle studies, and—" Ron leaned closer to the schedule, disbelieving. "Look, underneath that, arithmancy, 9 o'clock. I mean, I know you're good, Hermione, but no one's that good. How are you supposed to be in 3 classes at once?" "Don't be silly," said Hermione shortly. "Of course I won't be in 3 classes at once." "Well then, pass the marmalade," said Hermione. "But—" "Oh, Ron, what's it to you if my schedule's a bit full?" Hermione snapped. "I told you, I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." Just then, Hagrid entered the Great Hall. He was wearing his long moleskin overcoat and was absent-mindedly swinging a dead polecat from one enormous hand. "All right," he said eagerly, pausing on the way to the staff table. "You're in my first ever lesson, right after lunch. Been up since 5 getting everything ready. Hope it's okay. Me a teacher, honestly." He grinned broadly at them and headed off to the staff table, still swinging the polecat. "Wonder what he's been getting ready," said Ron, a note of anxiety in his voice. The hall was starting to empty as people headed off toward their first lesson. Ron checked his course schedule. "We'd better go. Look, divination's at the top of North Tower. It'll take us 10 minutes to get there." They finished their breakfast hastily, said goodbye to Fred and George, and walked back through the hall. As they passed the Slytherin table, Malfoy did yet another impression of a fainting fit. The shouts of laughter followed Harry into the entrance hall. The journey through the castle to North Tower was a long one. 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them everything about the castle, and they had never been inside North Tower before. "There's got to be a shortcut," Ron panted as they climbed their 7th-long staircase and emerged on an unfamiliar landing, where there was nothing but a large painting of a bare stretch of grass hanging on the stone wall. "I think it's this way," said Hermione, peering down the empty passage to the right. "Can't be," said Ron. "That's south. Look, you can see a bit of the lake out of the window." Harry was watching the painting. A fat, dapple-gray pony had just ambled onto the grass and was grazing nonchalantly. Harry was used to the subjects of Hogwarts paintings moving around and leaving their frames to visit one another, but he always enjoyed watching it. A moment later, a short, squat knight in a suit of armor clanked into the picture after his pony. By the look of the grass stains on his metal knees, he had just fallen off. "Aha!" he yelled, seeing Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "What villains are these that trespass upon my private lands? Come to scorn at my fall, perchance? Draw, you knaves, you dogs!" They watched in astonishment as the little knight tugged his sword out of its scabbard and began brandishing it violently, hopping up and down in a rage. But the sword was too long for him. A particular wild swing made him overbalanced, and he landed face down in the grass. "Are you all right?" said Harry, moving closer to the picture. "Get back, you scurvy braggart! Back, you rogue!" The knight seized his sword again and used it to push himself back up, but the blade sank deeply into the grass, and, though he pulled with all his might, he couldn't get it out again. Finally, he had to flop back down onto the grass and push up his visor to mop his sweating face. "Listen," said Harry, taking advantage of the knight's exhaustion. "We're looking for the North Tower. You don't know the way, do you?" "A quest!" The knight's rage seemed to vanish instantly. He clanked to his feet and shouted, "Come follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge." He gave the sword another fruitless tug, tried and failed to mount the fat pony, gave up, and cried, "On foot, then, good sirs and gentle lady! On! On!" And he ran, clanking loudly, into the left side of the frame and out of sight. They hurried after him along the corridor, following the sound of his armor. Every now and then they spotted him running through a picture ahead. "Be of stout heart, the worst is yet to come," yelled the knight, and they saw him reappear in front of an alarmed group of women in crinolines whose picture hung on the wall of a narrow spiral staircase. Puffing loudly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the tightly spiraling steps, getting dizzier and dizzier, until at last they heard the murmur of voices above them and knew they had reached the classroom. "Farewell!" cried the knight, popping his head into a painting of some sinister-looking monks. "Farewell, my comrades in arms! If ever you've need of noble heart and steely sinew, call upon Sir Cadogan." "Yeah, we'll call you," muttered Ron as the knight disappeared, "if we ever need someone mental." They climbed the last few steps and emerged onto a tiny landing where most of the class was already assembled. There were no doors off this landing, but Ron nudged Harry and pointed at the ceiling, where there was a circular trapdoor with a brass plaque on it. "Sybil Trelawney, divination teacher," Harry read. "How are we supposed to get up there?" As though in answer to his question, the trapdoor suddenly opened, and a silvery ladder descended right at Harry's feet. Everyone got quiet. "After you," said Ron, grinning, so Harry climbed the ladder first. He emerged into the strangest-looking classroom he had ever seen. In fact, it didn't look like a classroom at all, more like a cross between someone's attic and an old-fashioned tea shop. At least 20 small, circular tables were crammed inside it, all surrounded by chintz armchairs and fat little poofs. Everything was lit with a dim, crimson light. The curtains at the windows were all closed, and the many lamps were draped with dark red scarves. It was stiflingly warm, and the fire that was burning under the crowded mantelpiece was giving off a heavy, sickly sort of perfume as it heated a large copper kettle. The shelves running around the circular walls were crammed with dusty-looking feathers, stubs of candles, many packs of tattered playing cards, countless silvery crystal balls, and a huge array of teacups. Ron appeared at Harry's shoulder as the class assembled around them, all talking in whispers. "Where is she?" Ron said. A voice came suddenly out of the shadows, a soft, misty sort of voice. "Welcome," it said. "How nice to see you in the physical world at last." Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw that she was very thin. Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times their natural size, and she was draped in a gauzy spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung around her spindly neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings. "Sit, my children, sit," she said, and they all climbed awkwardly into armchairs or sank into poofs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat themselves around the same round table. "Welcome to divination," said Professor Trelawney, who had seated herself in a winged armchair in front of the fire. "My name is Professor Trelawney. You may not have seen me before. I find that descending too often into the hustle and bustle of the main school clouds my inner eye." Nobody said anything to this extraordinary pronouncement. Professor Trelawney delicately arranged her shawl and continued. So you have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magical arts. I must warn you at the outset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can take you only so far in this field. At these words, both Harry and Ron glanced, grinning at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't be much help in this subject. Many witches and wizards, talented though they are in the area of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mysteries of the future. Professor Trelawney went on, her enormous gleaming eyes moving from face to nervous face. It is a gift granted to few. You, boy, she said suddenly to Neville, who almost toppled off his poof. Is your grandmother well? I think so, said Neville tremulously. I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear, said Professor Trelawney, the firelight glinting on her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly. We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading the tea leaves. Next term we shall progress to palmistry. By the way, my dear, she shot suddenly at Parvati Patil, beware a red-haired man. Parvati gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him. In the second term, Professor Trelawney went on, we shall progress to the crystal ball. If we have finished with fire omens, that is. Unfortunately, class will be disrupted in February by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice, and around Easter, one of our number will leave us forever. A very tense silence followed this pronouncement, but Professor Trelawney seemed unaware of it. I wonder, dear, she said to Lavender Brown, who was nearest and shrank back in her chair, if you could pass me the largest silver teapot. Lavender, looking relieved, stood up, took an enormous teapot from the shelf, and put it down on the table in front of Professor Trelawney. Thank you, my dear. Incidentally, that thing you are dreading, it will happen on Friday the 16th of October. Lavender trembled. Now, I want you all to divide into pairs. Collect a teacup from the shelf, come to me, and I will fill it. Then sit down and drink. Drink until only the dregs remain. Swill these around the cup 3 times with your left hand, then turn the cup upside down on its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away, then give your cup to your partner to read. You will interpret the patterns using pages 5 and 6 of Unfogging the Future. I shall move among you, helping and instructing. Oh, and dear, she caught Neville by the arm as he made to stand up. After you've broken your first cup, would you be so kind as to select one of the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink. Sure enough, Neville had no sooner reached the shelf of teacups when there was a tinkle of breaking china. Professor Trelawney swept over to him holding a dustpan and brush and said, One of the blue ones, then, dear, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. When Harry and Ron had had their teacups filled, they went back to their table and tried to drink the scalding tea quickly. They swilled the dregs around as Professor Trelawney had instructed, then drained the cups and swapped over. Right, said Ron as they both opened their books at pages 5 and 6. What can you see in mine? A load of soggy brown stuff, said Harry. The heavily perfumed smoke in the room was making him feel sleepy and stupid. Broaden your minds, my dears, and allow your eyes to see past the mundane, Professor Trelawney cried through the gloom. Harry tried to pull himself together. Right, you've got a crooked sort of cross. He consulted Unfogging the Future. That means you're going to have trials and suffering. Sorry about that. But there's a thing that could be the sun. Hang on. That means great happiness? So you're going to suffer but be very happy? You need your inner eye tested, if you ask me, said Ron, and they both had to stifle their laughs as Professor Trelawney gazed in their direction. My turn. Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkled with effort. There's a blob a bit like a bowler hat. he said. Maybe you're going to work for the Ministry of Magic. He turned the teacup the other way up. But this way it looks more like an acorn. What's that? He scanned his copy of Unfogging the Future. A windfall. Unexpected gold. Excellent. You can lend me some. And there's a thing here. He turned the cup again. That looks like an animal. Yeah, if that was its head. It looks like a hippo. No, a sheep. Professor Trelawney whirled around as Harry let out a snort of laughter. Let me see that, my dear, she said reprovingly to Ron, sweeping over and snatching Harry's cup from him. Everyone went quiet to watch. Professor Trelawney was staring into the teacup, rotating it counterclockwise. The falcon. My dear, you have a deadly enemy. But everyone knows that, said Hermione in a loud whisper. Professor Trelawney stared at her. Well, they do, said Hermione. Everybody knows about Harry and you-know-who. Harry and Ron stared at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration. They had never heard Hermione speak to a teacher like that before. Professor Trelawney chose not to reply. She lowered her huge eyes to Harry's cup again and continued to turn it. The club. An attack. Dear, dear, this is not a happy cup. I thought that was a bowler hat, said Ron sheepishly. The skull. Danger in your path, my dear. Everyone was staring, transfixed, at Professor Trelawney, who gave the cup a final turn, gasped, and then screamed. There was another tinkle of breaking china. Neville had smashed his second cup. Professor Trelawney sank into a vacant armchair, her glittering hand at her heart and her eyes closed. My dear boy. Oh, my poor, dear boy. No, it is kinder not to say. No, don't ask me. What is it, Professor? Said Dean Thomas at once. Everyone had got to their feet, and slowly they crowded around Harry and Ron's table, pressing close to Professor Trelawney's chair to get a good look at Harry's cup. My dear, Professor Trelawney's huge eyes opened dramatically. You have the grim. The what? Said Harry. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him and Lavender Brown looked puzzled, but nearly everybody else clapped their hands to their mouths in horror. The grim, my dear, the grim, cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry hadn't understood. The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards. My dear boy, it is an omen, the worst omen, of death. Harry's stomach lurched. That dog on the cover of Death Omens in Flourish and Blots. The dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth, too. Everyone was looking at Harry, everyone except Hermione, who had gotten up and moved around to the back of Professor Trelawney's chair. I don't think it looks like a grim, she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. You'll forgive me for saying so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you, very little receptivity to the resonances of the future. Seamus Finnegan was tilting his head from side to side. It looks like a grim if you do this, he said, with his eyes almost shut, but it looks more like a donkey from here, he said, leaning to the left. When you've all finished deciding whether I'm going to die or not, said Harry, taking even himself by surprise. Now nobody seemed to want to look at him. I think we will leave the lesson here for today, said Professor Trelawney in her mistiest voice. Yes. Please pack away your things. Silently, the class took their teacups back to Professor Trelawney, packed away their books, and closed their bags. Even Ron was avoiding Harry's eyes. Until we meet again, said Professor Trelawney faintly. Fair fortune be yours. Oh, and dear, she pointed at Neville, you'll be late next time, so mind you work extra hard to catch up. Harry, Ron, and Hermione descended Professor Trelawney's ladder in the winding stair in silence, then set off for Professor McGonagall's transfiguration lesson. It took them so long to find her classroom that, early as they had left divination, they were only just in time. Harry chose a seat right at the back of the room, feeling as though he were sitting in a very bright spotlight. The rest of the class kept shooting furtive glances at him, as though he were about to drop dead at any moment. He hardly heard what Professor McGonagall was telling them about animagi, wizards who could transform at will into animals, and wasn't even watching when she transformed herself in front of their eyes into a tabby cat with spectacle markings around her eyes. "Really, what has gotten into you all today?" said Professor McGonagall, turning back into herself with a faint pop and staring around at them all. "Not that it matters, but the first time my transformation's not got applause from a class." Everybody's heads turned toward Harry again, but nobody spoke. Then Hermione raised her hand. "Please, Professor, we just had our first divination class, and we were reading the tea leaves, and—" "Ah, of course," said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. "There is no need to say any more, Miss Granger. Tell me, which of you will be dying this year?" Everyone stared at her. "Me," said Harry, finally. "I see," said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. "Then you should know, Potter, that Sybil Trelawney has predicted the death of one student a year since she arrived at this school. None of them has died yet. Seeing death omens is her favorite way of greeting a new class, if it were not for the fact that I never speak ill of my colleagues." Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on, more calmly. "Divination is one of the most imprecise branches of magic. I shall not conceal from you that I have very little patience with it. True seers are very rare, and Professor Trelawney—" She stopped again, and then said, in a very matter-of-fact tone, "You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will excuse me if I don't let you off homework today. I assure you that if you die, you need not hand it in." Hermione laughed. Harry felt a bit better. It was harder to feel scared of a lump of tea leaves away from the dim red light and befuddling perfume of Professor Trelawney's classroom. Not everyone was convinced, however. Ron still looked worried, and Lavender whispered, "But what about Neville's cup?" When the Transfiguration class had finished, they joined the crowd thundering toward the Great Hall for lunch. "Ron, cheer up," said Hermione, pushing a dish of stew toward him. "You heard what Professor McGonagall said." Ron spooned stew onto his plate and picked up his fork but didn't start. "Harry," he said in a low, serious voice, "you haven't seen a great black dog anywhere, have you?" "Yeah, I have," said Harry. "I saw one the night I left the Dursleys." Ron let his fork fall with a clatter. "Probably a stray," said Hermione calmly. Ron looked at Hermione as though she had gone mad. "Hermione, if Harry's seen a Grim, that's bad," he said. My Uncle Bilious saw one and he died 24 hours later." "Coincidence," said Hermione airily, pouring herself some pumpkin juice. "You don't know what you're talking about," said Ron, starting to get angry. "Grims scared the living daylights out of most wizards." "There you are, then," said Hermione in a superior tone. "They see the Grim and die of fright. The Grim's not an omen, it's the cause of death, and Harry's still with us because he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, I'd better kick the bucket then." Ron mouthed wordlessly at Hermione, who opened her bag, took out her new arithmancy book, and propped it open against the juice jug. "I think divination seems very woolly," she said, searching for her page. "A lot of guesswork, if you ask me." "There was nothing woolly about the Grim in that cup," said Ron hotly. "You didn't seem quite so confident when you were telling Harry it was a sheep," said Hermione coolly. "Professor Trelawney said you didn't have the right aura. You just don't like being bad at something for a change." He had touched a nerve. Hermione slammed her arithmancy book down on the table so hard that bits of meat and carrot flew everywhere. "If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death omens in a lump of tea leaves, I'm not sure I'll be studying it much longer. That lesson was absolute rubbish compared with my arithmancy class." She snatched up her bag and stalked away. Ron frowned after her. "What's she talking about?" he said to Harry. "She hasn't been to an arithmancy class yet." Harry was pleased to get out of the castle after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared. The sky was a clear, pale gray, and the grass was springy and damp underfoot as they set off for their first ever Care of Magical Creatures class. Ron and Hermione weren't speaking to each other. Harry walked beside them in silence as they went down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. It was only when he spotted only two familiar backs ahead of them that he realized they must be having these lessons with the Slytherins. Malfoy was talking animatedly to Crabbe and Goyle, who were chortling. Harry was quite sure he knew what they were talking about. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang the boarhound at his heels, looking impatient to start. "Come on now, get a move on," he called as the class approached. "Got a real treat for you today. Great lesson coming up. Everyone here? Right. Follow me." For one nasty moment, Harry thought that Hagrid was going to lead them into the forest. Harry had had enough unpleasant experiences in there to last him a lifetime. However, Hagrid strolled off around the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later, they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there. "Everyone gather round the fence here," he called. "That's it. Make sure you can see. Now, first thing you'll want to do is open your books." "How?" said the cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy. "Eh?" said Hagrid. "How do we open our books?" Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy of the Monster Book of Monsters, which had been bound shut with a length of rope. Other people took theirs out too. Some, like Harry, had belted their books shut. Others had crammed them inside tight bags or clamped them together with binder clips. Hasn't anyone been able to open their books?" said Hagrid, looking crestfallen. The class all shook their heads. "You've got to stroke 'em," said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Look." He took Hermione's copy and ripped off the spellotape chant about it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down its spine, and the book shivered, and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand. "Oh, how silly we've all been," Malfoy sneered. "We should have stroked them. Why didn't we guess?" I thought they were funny," Hagrid said uncertainly to Hermione. "Oh, tremendously funny," said Malfoy. "Really witty, giving us books that try and rip our hands off." "Shut up, Malfoy," said Harry quietly. Hagrid was looking downcast, and Harry wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success. "Right then," said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So you've got your books and now you need the magical creatures. Yeah, so I'll go and get 'em. Hang on." He strode away from them into the forest and out of sight. "God, this place is going to the dogs," said Malfoy loudly. "That oaf teaching classes. My father will have a fit when I tell him." "Shut up, Malfoy," Harry repeated. "Careful, Potter. There's a Dementor behind you." "Ooh!" squealed Lavender Brown, pointing toward the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting toward them were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be giant eagles, with cruel, steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were 1/2 a foot long and deadly-looking. Each of the beasts had a thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of all of these were held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock behind the creatures. "Gee up there!" he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures toward the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back slightly as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. "Hippogriffs," Hagrid roared happily, waving a hand at them. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once you got over the first shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, you started to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different color: stormy gray, bronze, pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. "So," said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around, "if you want to come a bit nearer." No one seemed to want to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously. "Now, first thing you gotta know about hippogriffs is they're proud," said Hagrid. "Easily offended, hippogriffs are. They'll never insult one, 'cause it might be the last thing you do." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting how best to disrupt the lesson. "You always wait for the hippogriff to make the first move," Hagrid continued. "It's polite, see? You walk toward him, and you bow, and you wait. If he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharpish, 'cause those talons hurt. Right. Who wants to go first?" Most of the class backed farther away in answer. Even Harry, Ron, and Hermione had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this. "No one," said Hagrid with a pleading look. I'll do it, said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and both Lavender and Parvati whispered, "Oh no, Harry, remember your tea leaves." Harry ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence. "Good man, Harry," roared Hagrid. "Right then, let's see how you get on with Buckbeak." He untied one of the chains, pulled the gray hippogriff away from its fellows, and slipped off its leather collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seemed to be holding its breath. Malfoy's eyes were narrowed maliciously. "Easy now, Harry," said Hagrid quietly. "You've got eye contact. Now try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much." Harry's eyes immediately began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak had turned his great, sharp head and was staring at Harry with one fierce orange eye. "That's it," said Hagrid. "That's it, Harry. Now, bow." Harry didn't feel much like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak, but he did as he was told. He gave a short bow and then looked up. The hippogriff was still staring haughtily at him. It didn't move. "Ah," said Hagrid, sounding worried. "Right. Back away now, Harry. Easy does it." But then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the hippogriff suddenly bent its scaly front knees and sank into what was an unmistakable bow. "Well done, Harry," said Hagrid, ecstatic. "Right. You can touch him. Pat his beak. Go on." Feeling that a better reward would have been to back away, Harry moved slowly toward the hippogriff and reached out toward it. He patted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed its eyes lazily, as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except for Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. "Right then, Harry," said Hagrid. "I reckon you might let you ride him." This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a hippogriff would be quite the same. "You climb up there, just behind the wing joint," said Hagrid, "and mind you don't pull any of his feathers out. He won't like that." Harry put his foot on the top of Buckbeak's wing and hoisted himself onto its back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure where to hold on. Everything in front of him was covered with feathers. "Go on, then," roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry. He just had time to seize the hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upward. It was nothing like a broomstick, and Harry knew which one he preferred. The hippogriff's wings beat uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs and making him feel like he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, and he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of his Nimbus 2000, he now found himself rocking backward and forward as the hindquarters of the hippogriff rose and fell with its wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had been dreading. He leaned back as the smooth neck lowered, feeling he was going to slip off over the beak, then felt a heavy thud as the 4 ill-assorted feet hit the ground. He just managed to hold on and push himself straight again. "Good work, Harry," roared Hagrid as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. "Okay, who else wants to go?" Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backward from his, which didn't seem to want to bend its knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on the chestnut, while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. He had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful. "This is very easy," Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him. "I knew it must have been, if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you?" he said to the hippogriff. "Are you, you great ugly brute?" It happened in a flash of steely talons. Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and the next moment Hagrid was wrestling Buckbeak back into his collar as he strained to get at Malfoy, who lay curled in the grass, blood blossoming over his robes. "I'm dying," Malfoy yelled as the class panicked. "I'm dying! Look at me! It's killed me!" "You're not dying," said Hagrid, who had gone very white. "Someone help me. Gotta get him out of here." Hermione ran to hold open the gate as Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw that there was a long, deep gash on Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass, and Hagrid ran with him up the slope toward the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed at a walk. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. "You should fire him straight away," said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. "It was Malfoy's fault," snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance hall. "I'm going to see if he's okay," said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to Gryffindor Tower. "Do you think he'll be all right?" said Hermione nervously. "Of course he will. Madame Pomfrey can mend cuts in about a second," said Harry, who had had far worse injuries mended magically by the nurse. "That was a really bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first class, though, wasn't it?" said Ron, looking worried. "Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him." They were among the first to reach the great hall at dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there. "They wouldn't fire him, would they?" said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak and kidney pudding. "They'd better not," said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, was huddled together, deep in conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy had been injured. "Well, you can't say it wasn't an interesting first day back," said Ron gloomily. They went up to the crowded Gryffindor common room after dinner and tried to do the homework Professor McGonagall had given them, but all three of them kept breaking off and glancing out of the tower window. "There's a light on in Hagrid's window," Harry said suddenly. Ron looked at his watch. "If we hurried, we could go down and see him. It's still quite early." "I don't know," Hermione said slowly, and Harry saw her glance at him. "I'm allowed to walk across the grounds," he said pointedly. "Sirius Black hasn't gone past the Dementors yet, has he?" So they put their things away and headed out of the portrait hole, glad to meet nobody on their way to the front doors, as they weren't entirely sure they were supposed to be out. The grass was still wet and looked almost black in the twilight. When they reached Hagrid's hut, they knocked, and a voice growled, "Come in." Hagrid was sitting in his shirt sleeves at his scrubbed wooden table. His boarhound, Fang, had his head in Hagrid's lap. One look told them that Hagrid had been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard almost as big as a bucket in front of him, and he seemed to be having difficulty getting them into focus. "'Spect it's a record," he said thickly when he recognized them. "Don't reckon they've ever had a teacher who lasted only a day before." "You haven't been fired, Hagrid?" gasped Hermione. "Not yet," said Hagrid miserably, taking a huge gulp of whatever was in the tankard. "But's only a matter of time, after Malfoy." "How is he?" said Ron as they all sat down. "It wasn't serious, was it?" "Madame Pomfrey fixed him best she could," said Hagrid dully. "But he's saying it's still agony, covered in bandages, moaning." "He's faking it," said Harry at once. "Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She regrew half my bones last year. Trust Malfoy to milk it for all it's worth." "School governors have been told, of course," said Hagrid miserably. "They reckon I started too big. Should have left hippogriffs for later. Done flobber worms or summit. Just thought I'd make a good first lesson. It's all my fault." "It's all Malfoy's fault, Hagrid," said Hermione earnestly. "We're witnesses," said Harry. "You said hippogriffs attack if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem that he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened." "Yeah, don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up," said Ron. Tears leaked out of the crinkled corners of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug. "I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid," said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Maybe she's right," said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. "What's he done?" said Harry nervously as Hermione came back in with the empty tankard. "Stuck his head in the water barrel," said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping the water out of his eyes. "That's better," he said, shaking his head like a dog and drenching them all. "Listen, it was good of you to come and see me. I really—" Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he'd only just realized he was there. "What do you think you're doing, eh?" he roared so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air. "You're not to go wandering around after dark, Harry. And you two, letting him." Hagrid strode over to Harry, grabbed his arm, and pulled him to the door. "Come on," Hagrid said angrily. "I'm taking you all back up to your school, and don't let me catch you walking down to see me after dark again. I'm not worth that." Chapter 7. The Boggart in the Wardrobe. Malfoy didn't reappear in classes until late on Thursday morning, when the Slytherins and Gryffindors were halfway through double potions. He swaggered into the dungeon, his right arm covered in bandages and bound up in a sling, acting, in Harry's opinion, as though he were the heroic survivor of some dreadful battle. "How is it, Draco?" simpered Pansy Parkinson. "Does it hurt much?" "Yeah," said Malfoy, putting on a brave sort of grimace, but Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy had looked away. Settle down," said Professor Snape idly. Harry and Ron scowled at each other. Snape wouldn't have said settle down if they'd walked in late. He'd have given them detention. But Malfoy had always been able to get away with anything in Snape's classes. Snape was head of Slytherin House and generally favored his own students above all others. They were making a new potion today, a shrinking solution. Malfoy set up his cauldron right next to Harry and Ron so that they were preparing their ingredients on the same table. "Sir," Malfoy called. "Sir, I'll need help cutting up these daisy roots because of my arm." "Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him," said Snape without looking up. Ron went brick red. "There's nothing wrong with your arm," he hissed at Malfoy. Malfoy smirked across the table. "Weasley, you heard Professor Snape. Cut up these roots." Ron seized his knife, pulled Malfoy's roots toward him, and began to chop them roughly so that they were all different sizes. "Professor," drawled Malfoy, "Weasley's mutilating my roots, sir." Snape approached their table, stared down his hooked nose at the roots, then gave Ron an unpleasant smile from beneath his long, greasy black hair. "Change roots with Malfoy, Weasley." "But, sir..." Ron had spent the last quarter of an hour carefully shredding his own roots into exactly equal pieces. "Now," said Snape in his most dangerous voice. Ron shoved his own beautifully cut roots across the table at Malfoy, then took up the knife again. "And, sir, I'll need this shrivel fig skinned," said Malfoy, his voice full of malicious laughter. "Potter, you can skin Malfoy's shrivel fig," said Snape, giving Harry the look of loathing he always reserved just for him. Harry took Malfoy's shrivel fig as Ron began trying to repair the damage to the roots he now had to use. Harry skinned the shrivel fig as fast as he could and flung it back across the table at Malfoy without speaking. Malfoy was smirking more broadly than ever. "Seen your pal Hagrid lately?" he asked them quietly. "None of your business," said Ron jerkily, without looking up. "I'm afraid he won't be a teacher much longer," said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow. "Father's not very happy about my injury." "Keep talking, Malfoy, and I'll give you a real injury," snarled Ron. "He's complained to the school governors and to the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a lot of influence, you know, and a lasting injury like this." He gave a huge, fake sigh. "Who knows if my arm will ever be the same again?" "So that's why you're putting it on," said Harry, accidentally beheading a dead caterpillar because his hand was shaking in anger. "To try to get Hagrid fired." "Well," said Malfoy, lowering his voice to a whisper, "partly, Potter. But there are other benefits, too. Weasley, slice my caterpillars for me." A few cauldrons away, Neville was in trouble. Neville regularly went to pieces in potions lessons. It was his worst subject, and his great fear of Professor Snape made things 10 times worse. His potion, which was supposed to be a bright, acid green, had turned orange, Longbottom, said Snape, lighting some up and allowing it to splash back into the cauldron so that everyone could see. "Orange. Tell me, boy, does anything penetrate that thick skull of yours? Didn't you hear me say, quite clearly, that only one rat spleen was needed? Didn't I state plainly that a dash of leech juice would suffice? What do I have to do to make you understand, Longbottom?" Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was on the verge of tears. "Please, sir," said Hermione. "Please, I could help Neville put in right." "I don't remember asking you to show off, Miss Granger," said Snape coldly, and Hermione went as pink as Neville. "Longbottom, at the end of this lesson you will feed a few drops of this potion to your toad and see what happens. Perhaps that will encourage you to do it properly." Snape moved away, leaving Neville breathless with fear. "Help me," he moaned to Hermione. "Hey, Harry," said Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to borrow Harry's brass scales. "Have you heard? Daily Prophet this morning. They reckon Sirius Black's been sighted." "Where?" said Harry and Ron quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening closely. "Not too far from here," said Seamus, who looked excited. It was a muggle who saw him. Of course, she didn't really understand. The muggles think he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? So she phoned the telephone hotline. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone. Not too far from here, Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry. He turned around and saw Malfoy watching closely. What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned? But Malfoy's eyes were shining malevolently, and they were fixed on Harry. He leaned across the table. Thinking of trying to catch Black single-handed, Potter? Yeah, that's right, said Harry half-handedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curving in a mean smile. Of course, if it was me, he said quietly, I'd have done something before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd be out there looking for him. What are you talking about, Malfoy? Said Ron roughly. Don't you know, Potter? Breathed Malfoy, his pale eyes narrowed. Know what? Malfoy let out a low, sneering laugh. Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck, he said. Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself. What are you talking about? Said Harry angrily, but at that moment Snape called. You should have finished adding your ingredients by now. This potion needs to stew before it can be drunk, so clear away while it simmers, and then we'll test Longbottoms. Crabbe and Goyle laughed openly, watching Neville sweat as he stirred his potion feverishly. Hermione was muttering instructions to him out of the corner of her mouth, so that Snape wouldn't see. Harry and Ron packed away their unused ingredients and went to wash their hands and ladles in the stone basin in the corner. What did Malfoy mean? Harry muttered to Ron as he stuck his hands under the icy jet that poured from the gargoyle's mouth. Why would I want revenge on Black? He hasn't done anything to me. Yet. He's making it up, said Ron savagely. He's trying to make you do something stupid. The end of the lesson in sight, Snape strode over to Neville, who was cowering by his cauldron. Everyone gather round, said Snape, his black eyes glittering, and watch what happens to Longbottom's toad. If he has managed to produce a shrinking solution, it will shrink to a tadpole. If, as I don't doubt, he has done it wrong, his toad is likely to be poisoned. The Gryffindors watched fearfully. The Slytherins looked excited. Snape picked up Trevor the Toad in his left hand and dipped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which was now green. He trickled a few drops down Trevor's throat. There was a moment of hushed silence in which Trevor gulped. Then there was a small pop, and Trevor the Tadpole was wiggling in Snape's palm. The Gryffindors burst into applause. Snape, looking sour, pulled a small bottle from the pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on top of Trevor, and he reappeared suddenly full-grown. 5 points from Gryffindor, said Snape, which wiped the smiles from every face. I told you not to help him, Miss Granger. Class dismissed. Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the steps to the entrance hall. Harry was still thinking about what Malfoy had said, while Ron was seething about Snape. 5 points from Gryffindor because the potion was all right? Why didn't you lie, Hermione? You should have said Neville did it all by himself. Hermione didn't answer. Ron looked around. Where is she? Harry turned too. They were at the top of the steps now, watching the rest of the class pass them, heading for the Great Hall and lunch. She was right behind us, said Ron, frowning. Malfoy passed them, walking between Crabbe and Goyle. He smirked at Harry and disappeared. There she is, said Harry. Hermione was panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs. One hand clenched her bag, the other seemed to be tucking something down the front of her robes. How did you do that? Said Ron. What? Said Hermione, joining them. 1 minute you were right behind us, the next moment you were back at the bottom of the stairs again. What? Hermione looked slightly confused. Oh, I had to go back for something. Oh, no. A seam had split on Hermione's bag. Harry wasn't surprised. He could see that it was crammed with at least a dozen large and heavy books. Why are you carrying all these around with you? Ron asked her. You know how many subjects I'm taking, said Hermione breathlessly. Couldn't hold these for me, could you? But Ron was turning over the book she had handed him, looking at the covers. You haven't got any of these subjects today. It's only Defense Against the Dark Arts this afternoon. Oh, yes, said Hermione vaguely, but she packed all the books back into her bag just the same. I hope there's something good for lunch. I'm starving, she added, and she marched off towards the Great Hall. Do you get the feeling Hermione's not telling us something? Ron asked Harry. Professor Lupin wasn't there when they arrived at his first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. They all sat down, took out their books, quills, and parchment, and were talking when he finally entered the room. Lupin smiled vaguely and placed his tatty old briefcase on the teacher's desk. He was as shabby as ever, but looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals. "Good afternoon," he said. "Would you please put all your books back in your bags? Today will be a practical lesson. You will need only your wands." A few curious looks were exchanged as the class put away their books. They had never had a practical defense against the dark arts before, unless you counted the memorable class last year when their old teacher had brought a cage full of pixies to class and set them loose. "Right then," said Professor Lupin when everyone was ready. "If you'd follow me." Puzzled but interested, the class got to its feet and followed Professor Lupin out of the classroom. He led them along the deserted corridor and around a corner, where the first thing they saw was Peeves the poltergeist, who was floating upside down in midair and stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum. Peeves didn't look up until Professor Lupin was 2 feet away. Then he wiggled his curly-toed feet and broke into sang. "Loony loopy Lupin," Peeves sang. "Loony loopy Lupin, loony loopy Lupin." Rude and unmanageable as he almost always was, Peeves usually showed some respect toward the teachers. Everyone looked quickly at Professor Lupin to see how he would take this. To their surprise, he was still smiling. "I'd take that gum out of the keyhole if I were you, Peeves," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Filch won't be able to get into his brooms." Filch was the Hogwarts caretaker, a bad-tempered, failed wizard who waged a constant war against the students and, indeed, Peeves. However, Peeves paid no attention to Professor Lupin's words, except to blow a loud, wet raspberry. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. "This is a useful little spell," he told the class over his shoulder. "Please watch closely." He raised the wand to shoulder height, said, "Whatta," and pointed it at Peeves. With the force of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and straight down Peeves' left nostril. He whirled upright and zoomed away, cursing. "Cool, sir," said Dean Thomas in amazement. "Thank you, Dean," said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away again. "Shall we proceed?" They set off again, the class looking at shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. He led them down a second corridor and stopped right outside the staff room door. "Inside, please," said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long paneled room full of old, mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair, and he looked around as the class filed in. His eyes were glittering, and there was a nasty sneer playing around his mouth. As Professor Lupin came in and made to close the door behind him, Snape said, "Leave it open, Lupin. I'd rather not witness this." He got to his feet and strode past the class, his black robes billowing behind him. At the doorway, he turned on his heel and said, "Possibly no one's warned you, Lupin, but this class contains Neville Longbottom. I would advise you not to entrust him with anything difficult, not unless Miss Granger is hissing instructions in his ear." Neville went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Neville in his own classes, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. "I was hoping that Neville would assist me with the first stage of the operation," he said, "and I am sure he will perform it admirably." Neville's face went, if possible, even redder. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class toward the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe where the teachers kept their spare robes. As Professor Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin calmly, because a few people had jumped backward in alarm. "There's a boggart in there." Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about. Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Boggarts like dark, enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gap beneath beds, the cupboards under sinks. I've even met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to give my third years some practice. So, the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a boggart?" Hermione put up her hand. "It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us most." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. "So, the boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears. This means, said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry? Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting, but Harry had to go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be? Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become, a headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake. Tried to frighten 2 people at once and turned himself into half a slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a boggart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, said the class together. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good. But that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough. And this is where you come in, Neville. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Neville, who walked forward as though he were heading for the gallows. Right, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you most in the world? Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. Didn't catch that, Neville. Sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly as though begging someone to help him, then said, in a barely more than a whisper, Professor Snape? Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Professor Snape. Neville, I believe you live with your grandmother? Yes, said Neville nervously. But I don't want the boggart to turn into her either. No, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder, could you tell us what sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled, but said, Well, always the same hat, a tall one with a stuffed vulture on top, and a long dress, green, normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag? Prompted Professor Lupin. A big red one, said Neville. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes, said Neville uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. When the boggart bursts out of this wardrobe, Neville, and sees you, it will assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand, thus, and cry, Ridiculous, and concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Boggart Snape will be forced into that vulture-topped hat and that green dress with that big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter. The wardrobe wobbled more violently. If Neville is successful, the boggart is likely to shift his attention to each of us in turn, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you most, and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. A Voldemort returned to full strength, but before he had even started to plan a possible counterattack on a boggart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand, slithering back beneath a black cloak, a long, rattling breath from an unseen mouth, then a cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. Harry shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, Take its legs off. Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. Everyone ready, said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear. He wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. Neville, we're going to back away, said Professor Lupin. Let you have a clear field, all right? I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now, so Neville can get a clear shot. They all retreated, backed against the walls, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale and frightened, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his robes and was holding his wand ready. "On the count of 3, Neville," said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3. Now! A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down upon him, reaching inside his robes. Ridiculous, squeaked Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress and a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and he was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter. The boggart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati, forward!" Parvati walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There was another crack, and where he stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turned to Parvati, and it began to walk toward her very slowly, dragging its feet, its stiff arms rising. "Ridiculous!" cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet. It became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. "Seamus!" roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Parvati. Crack! Where the mummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room, a long, wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. "Ridiculous!" shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle, then crack! Became a rattlesnake, which slithered and writhed before crack! Becoming a single, bloody eyeball. "It's confused!" shouted Lupin. "We're getting there. Dean!" Dean hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and began to creep along the floor like a crab. "Ridiculous!" yelled Dean. There was a snap, and the hand was trapped in a mousetrap. "Excellent. Ron, you're next." Ron leapt forward. Crack! Quite a few people screamed. A giant spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. For a moment, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, "Ridiculous!" bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished. It rolled over and over. Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way, and it came to a halt at Harry's feet. He raised his wand, ready, but... "Here!" shouted Professor Lupin suddenly, hurrying forward. Crack! The legless spider had vanished. For a second, everyone looked wildly around to see where it was. Then they saw a silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, "Ridiculous!" almost lazily. Crack! "Forward, Neville, and finish him off," said Lupin as the boggart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack! Snape was back. This time Neville charged forward looking determined. "Ridiculous!" he shouted, and they had a split-second's view of Snape in his lacy dress before Neville let out a great "ha!" of laughter, and the boggart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and was gone. "Excellent!" cried Professor Lupin as the class broke into applause. "Excellent, Neville. Well done, everyone. Let me see. 5 points to Gryffindor for every person to tackle the boggart, 10 for Neville because he did it twice, and 5 each to Hermione and Harry." "But I didn't do anything," said Harry. "You and Hermione answered my questions correctly at the start of the class, Harry," Lupin said lightly. "Very well, everyone. An excellent lesson. Homework, kindly read the chapter on boggarts and summarize it for me, to be handed in on Monday. That will be all." Talking excitedly, the class left the staff room. Harry, however, wasn't feeling cheerful. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped him from tackling the boggart. Why? Was it because he'd seen Harry collapse on the train and thought he wasn't up to much? Had he thought Harry would pass out again? But no one else seemed to have noticed anything. "Did you see me take that banshee?" shouted Seamus. "And the hand," said Dean, waving his own around. "And Snape in that hat. And my mummy." "I wonder why Professor Lupin's frightened of crystal balls," said Lavender thoughtfully. "That was the best defense against the dark arts lesson we've ever had, wasn't it?" said Ron excitedly as they made their way back to the classroom to get their bags. "He seems like a very good teacher," said Hermione approvingly, "but I wish I could have had a turn with the boggart." "What would it have been for you?" said Ron, sniggering. A piece of homework that only got 9 out of 10? And that is where we will leave off for today. Thank you for joining me for a couple more chapters of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. If you liked it, make sure to check out everything that is backlogged here on YouTube, as well as all of the things that you can find in the Linktree link down in the description. Next week, we start our foray into what is going to be likely a year-long book. It's going to take a while. If you haven't figured it out at this point, just stick around for next week, because you'll figure it out. So thank you all so much. I have been Matthew Allen. This has been What a Book, and I will see all of you next week.